Thirdly, and conversely, I wondered, is there perhaps something in the creative genius narrative? Would we feel, how would we feel about the system? Would we be content for the system to produce inequality if at least we could convince ourselves that the system truly rewarded sort of intellectual Wilt Chamberlains, to use, to sort of draw on Nozick's famous analogy? Fourthly and finally, and I think this is perhaps in some ways the most controversial question, to what extent, if at all, does the IP system have the power to redress inequality, either within countries or between countries? So within countries, do we think of things like moral rights or provisions that are designed to reward employee inventors? Are they in some ways sort of market corrective instruments that may actually redress certain forms of inequality? And then, of course, there's a question, as between countries, are there ways in which the intellectual property system might actually have the power to help deliver on certain development strategies? For example, we commonly see that argument being touted in relation to justifications for GI protection. So it seemed to me that Daniel's come up with a really extraordinarily important lens through which to start re-examining intellectual property. And I'm really grateful to him for, as I say, for all of his hard work. And with that, I might actually hand over to you, if that's okay, Daniel. And I think you're going to talk a bit about how the sessions are going to run and some of what you hope to achieve from this workshop.
Thank you, Robert, for the hospitality and kind words and for the meaningful cooperation in organizing today's timely event together with Professors Dave Gangji and Robert. All three of us, including myself, take great pleasure in hosting this event and welcoming you all today. I'd also wish to acknowledge the institutional cooperation between the Oxford IP Research Center at the Oxford Law School and at the Haifa Center of Law and Technology at the University of Haifa Faculty of Law. I'd like to further extend my gratitude to the superb administrative assistance we received, especially from Oxford's Miss Letitia Darrington and Haifa's Miss Lilifai Bishor. I'd also wish to re-acknowledge and follow Robert in welcoming wholeheartedly two truly legendary keynote speakers today. Both in their respectful camps have made an impact of historical magnitude at the World Bank, at WIPO, and the academia. These are again Columbia Business School Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz and the World Intellectual Property Organization's fourth Director General, Francis Gurry. Thank you. We're all deeply honored to have you with us. As part of the forthcoming discussion, we shall be hearing talks from numerous contributors to the forthcoming mentioned book, and like with other pre-launch book events, we plan it to be a win-win situation for both the general principle discussion as well as the book's chapters and their authors. The book, I might add, is a vast project as it includes the research of 25 authors and co-authors and should be published later this year and be freely accessible for everyone online. Given the number, the number of papers on IP inequality sums up to less than 24, the forthcoming book would literally double the amount of papers in the field. I'd like to consequently take the opportunity to thank my distinguished co-editors. These are WIPO's Francis Gurry, Texas A&M University Law Professor Peter Yu, and of course the renowned Seoul National University economist Kun Lee, who is also the recent president of the famed International Schumpeter Society. At the outset of our discussion, there are two questions this workshop is hoping to target. The first is how does IP affect inequality? The second question is how can IP policy reduce or alleviate inequality? In my next few comments, I'd like to tentatively and quickly comment on the former, namely how does IP law possibly affect inequality? In so doing, I'd like to share with you 5 observations concerning IP when affecting inequality. The first relates to the relatively high rates of inequality due to IP and innovation-related concentration. That is concentration at the global level, but even within wealthy nations. The academic literature and that of WIPO itself, including WIPO's chief economist, Carsten Fink, and others, in one of our book's chapters, attest to the fact that not only is innovation more concentrated than other economic activities, but in fact, immediately following R&D rates, patenting concentration rates trump the list of most economically concentrated innovative activity among those the paper compares. As Carton Fink's paper indicates, patenting rates are remarkably more concentrated than export rates, than GDP rates, human capital measured through R&D personnel rates, and scientific publication rates. There seem to be several reasons behind such concentration. A lot of these have to do with the virtuous circle of the archetypal national innovation systems, and within these, the cycles of the dubbed local innovation ecosystems, which innovation theorists regularly consider. Innovative activity as
Daniel, we can't hear you.
Daniel, you've been muted.
Which seem to confirm how the best higher education and research institutes appear and consolidate in certain regions of the world. The same seems to apply to the private sector, where research and technology intensive companies flourish in such highly concentrated conditions. It is therefore probable that industrial IP concentration, and especially patents, account for much of the extreme rates of innovation production concentration upon the inequality shares patents inflict all told. The second observation underlies the lack of scholarly consensus regarding the effect of the IP has on inequality upon inequality's varying manifestations. At the outset, much of the existing literature on the relationship between innovation and inequality deals primarily with the effect of technological change on wage or income inequality within an economy. There are some important findings, such as by the renowned Harvard economist Philip Aguillon or Rodrigo Mendes or Darren Akemulgo. However, relatively fewer studies examine the reverse relationship of the effect of population-wide inequality on innovation. That is, even though there is a fair amount of literature that looks at the market structure, namely at concentration of industry and its relation to innovation. The underlying notion remains that innovation in production requires large markets, yet as I open it by saying there is still no consensus concerning the main top income inequality factors therein. In progress of understanding inequality is to continue, if that progress is to continue, one should consider the present discrepancy concerning the effect of IP on one of the four main categories of economic inequality, which thus far have been mixed up and oftentimes ignored. These are access inequality, gender inequality, opportunity inequality, and outcome inequality. I'd like to quickly illustrate how this lack of a theoretical consensus might look like. Think of gender inequality, accounting for the gender gap between female and male patentees. If gender differences are not carefully accounted for, patenting rate discrepancies within the sexes would sometimes barely make it an account of the political theory notion of outcome inequality, instead of the unattained gender inequality as it actually occurs. Lastly, seen from a development economics perspective, when thinking of inequality across the North-South divide, it is also the case that most studies focusing on US data, US PTOs, the US Corporate Office, etc., and with little exception, especially outside of OECD countries. As a result, the contribution of South-South IP and trade to global inequality still remains largely unaccounted for. Researchers, truth be told, often do not even remember to fence off South-South IP and trade in their US and OECD-based findings. There is a third characteristic of IP-based inequality research to be considered. Accordingly, if IP is to become a policy lever for reducing inequality, it could quite uniquely overcome the daunting challenge of what I suggest we consider as a northern country's NIMBY, not in my backyard policy. Innovation, inequality alleviation, but this time also in my northern backyard, as it were. By means of comparison, the two central UN level development policies, namely poverty alleviation and sustainable development, seem to have had only suboptimal results, as the donor countries of the North have repeatedly failed to funnel sufficient funds, especially with food and drugs, including vaccines. With policy alleviation and sustainable development, we continually witness a lack of access to food and medicines, yet this imbalance is not necessarily due to a lack of resources, but to a large degree due to a lack of political will by northern governments. As it is well understood, we have enough.
Rochelle Dreyfus, and Rochelle will be speaking to technology and technological inequality. Rochelle is the Pauline Newman Professor of Law at NYU and co-director of its Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy. Rochelle has written widely across intellectual property, including international IP, with a particular focus on patents, on trade secrets, and on innovation policy. Recent work has focused on international IP, so the breathing spaces within TRIPS, bilateral agreements, and international dispute settlement regimes which involve IP. But of perhaps particular relevance is a co-edited volume on balancing wealth and health, looking at access to health and IP across Latin America. And our third speaker is Peter Yu, Professor Peter Yu, who's going to be speaking on intellectual property, global inequality, and subnational policy variations, which is, again, one of the chapters contributing to the volume. Professor Peter Yu is the Regents Professor of Law and Communication and the Director at the Center for Law and IP at Texas A&M University. Peter's well known as an international and comparative IP scholar, and he's written sort of widely across this space, including an emphasis on the international trade dimensions of IP. His recent work is very interesting. He's been looking at algorithms and sort of inequality in the context of algorithms and AI as well. And his focus has been on not just inequality between countries, but within countries as well.
Sounds good. So basically, you have to spend some time.
With that, I might quickly remind everyone to check that their mics are on mute, and I would like Amy to take the virtual floor, please. Amy, over to you.
Thanks so much, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you all virtually today, and look forward to this conversation. So I offered to speak for, I think, hopefully maybe just about 10 minutes about the political economy of intellectual property and inequality. So offering some ways to think analytically about why IP may in fact exacerbate inequality and facilitate concentration, as Dev mentioned, drawn from a draft that I wrote some 5 years ago called 5 Hypotheses on IP and Inequality. That's floating around there on the internet, and some of the law and political economy work that I've been doing recently. So first, a little bit of introduction to that law and political economy work, because it, I know, won't be known to all of you. So there's a broad group of us in the United States, although increasingly also in Europe, a network of scholars interested in law and political economy. And that formation sort of urging that we take political economy more seriously in legal thought and also in our policy analysis is coming out of work that many of us have been doing, in fact, for quite a long time, and draws on earlier traditions of legal scholarship from critical legal studies and legal realism to critical race and gender theory. And broadly, that the group of people interested in political economy and law are concerned about the rising inequality and precarity, the persistence of racialized and gendered hierarchy, the hollowing out of democracy in so many parts of the world, the climate crisis, and the failures, we believe, of our kind of mainstream legal paradigms to really adequately grapple with the drivers of these problems or solutions to them. And broadly, as I've written with some co-authors in a piece in the Yale Law Journal recently, we see the rise of neoliberal ideas and particularly their embedding in law as a particularly important component of what has facilitated both these developments, but also the inability of legal scholarship to, in some sense, get as much traction as we might like on problems such as rising inequality. And I think intellectual property is actually one of these fields that in some sense was consolidated as a field conjoined by ideas drawn from law and economics, very much sort of reshaped in the 1980s and 90s, both through legal change, so the introduction of institutions like the WTO and the TRIPS agreement and the consolidation of new IP treaties, but also a change in legal thought and legal argument about IP that really put efficiency, positive efficiency, as the central value for intellectual property. There's much more to say on this than I could possibly in 10 minutes, but very briefly, and there's more in these pieces if people are interested. I think there's a very deep problem with the thought that efficiency is an adequate principle to guide us in a field like intellectual property, because effectively, particularly if we're thinking about inequality as we are here today, efficiency operates according to a kind of willingness to pay principle. The core that is in the center of efficiency is typically wealth maximization. And so those who can pay, in fact, not even are willing to pay, but able to pay, are served better and their wants are satisfied. And those who cannot are typically not. There's all kinds of, I think, good evidence that willingness to pay or wealth maximization are not normatively attractive, and that in fact they do exacerbate, this way of looking at things, exacerbate inequality and create what my colleague Zach Liskow calls an accession principle. Those who have get more. And of course, in the international order, we see very much something similar, as well as something that I think what Quinn Slobodian in his excellent book Globalists calls the use of international law to encase markets from redistributive aspirations. And of course, I think one way to look at the TRIPS agreement, although of course it's defended by many on grounds of global efficiency, it certainly is not organized in a way that any information economist would argue would truly be the case. For example, encompassing commitments to R&D, allowing more than is true in the agreement in terms of overriding of patents and exceptions for low and middle income countries. We see, of course, with the global vaccination situation, some of the limitations. I'm happy to talk more about that if people are interested of the current paradigm. So the international system is very much, I think, reflective of some of these similar problems of the prioritization of a particular kind of, in fact, set of market actors. The bigger ones do better. And sort of capital is privileged over a democratic impulse to redistribute, or simply acknowledge that we ought to have and foster an innovation policy and an industrial policy that meets our collective needs and that serves democracy, rather than in some sense standing outside of it and being asked, and democracy being asked to sort of accommodate the market. All right, so that's a few minutes on law and political economy and how I might situate our conversation about intellectual property in that broader tradition that is emerging. Let me say a few things just about the 5 theses in this paper. So why would we suspect that intellectual property law and exclusive rights and information in particular might exacerbate inequality? And I'll say a little bit about them, but let me just set the 5 out here on the table first. So one, that in both information and intellectual property law, there's reason to think that we see returns to scale. And so those who have intellectual property gaining more than others. Second, intellectual property may amplify inequality because information is a scalable good. Third, that intellectual property is not a system that's equally available to all. It's costly to obtain, maintain, and defend. Fourth, that we see many examples where intellectual property tends to concentrate political power, and that has to do, we could theorize that that has to do with the value for rights holders of gathering together and trying to impose their views on those policymakers, whether sort of domestically or transnationally. And then last, the last sort of hypothesis in the paper is that we should also look to IP and information policy for remedies to inequality. And so not just things like tax and transfer, but also how we organize intellectual property ought to be remedies. So let me talk a little bit more about some of these, given the limited time. You know, I'll leave further exploration of others for the discussion. So what do I mean, for example, when I say intellectual property and information, the centrality of information in our economy facilitates returns to scale? So there's a way in which, and this is a little bit foreshadowed by what I said earlier, that anytime you center markets as a kind of key measure of what goods are created and how they're distributed, you are, of course, going to reflect existing inequalities, precisely because markets allocate both decisions about what to innovate in and how they should be distributed according to ability to pay. And not just willingness to pay. And that's particularly obvious when you're thinking globally, but it's also true domestically, anywhere that you don't have some kind of perfect insurance system. But what I wanted to sort of suggest with this first piece about returns to scale is that there's a way to think about information and intellectual property, not just as sort of reproducing and refracting inequalities, inability to pay, but also maybe dynamically accelerating them over time. And the thought here is really drawn from Piketty's idea that if the rate of return on capital exceeds the rate of growth, that inequality will tend to grow over time. So if you have higher returns to certain kinds of capital, that those may then, in fact, accelerate inequality. And information, of course, itself is an area where we think about there being high fixed costs and low marginal costs. So that means average costs drop with size. This is part of the concentrating effect, I think, that we see, that we classically expect in the digital age, add to that network effects, and becomes, I think, quite plausible that there's something about exclusive rights and information themselves, particularly in a context of digital networks, that will generate increasing returns to scale. And intellectual property itself, and here in the paper draft, I point to Yochai Benkler's work on this many years ago, that intellectual property itself, precisely because of the kind of transaction costs associated with its use, will tend to create incentives for rights holders, the Disneys of the world, as Yochai puts it, to vertically integrate new production with management of large-scale owned inventories of existing information, right? You internalize the transaction costs, and getting bigger helps you avoid some of the, in fact, as we know, very substantial costs of transacting around intellectual property rights. And in fact, many information industries do seem to be highly concentrated. And what I suggest in the paper is that that's one thing that we should be, interested in and producing much more empirical work on, because of course there is a possible alternative way to imagine this story going, which is that low barriers to entry, which of course also are associated with the digital age in particular, could create more entry and therefore deconcentrate. But I think some of the empirical evidence that we see out there of concentration suggests that low barriers to entry are swamped by these other kinds of effects about concentration. The second point, the scalability of information. This point is really scalability, meaning that one can increase volume without increasing marginal contributions of labor or capital. The sort of basic insight here is you could have, sort of one opera singer for the world rather than an opera singer in every town once it becomes possible to digitally record and then transmit those recordings. So that notion, of course, can, and scalable markets tend to feature very, very high levels of concentration and very, very sort of monstrous inequalities. So that's the second thesis. The IP is unequally available to all. Well, that will be very apparent to everybody in this group, and that there just simply are costs depending on the type of intellectual property. They for sure differ, and it'd be interesting to think about that fact, but there are costs to obtaining and then particularly maintaining and defending intellectual property rights. All legal rights have this quality, of course, but many other areas of law have other kinds of systems or other institutions, social or political institutions, to address those problems. In intellectual property, we do, of course, have things like, scale, modified fee scales and things like that. Of course, adding to that, and I imagine part of the conversation today already has been and will continue to be, that the kinds of things we protect as intellectual property are, in fact, tend to prioritize the contributions that some groups of people make over others, and that has race, class, and of course, geographic dimensions to it. All right, I think I will stop there and just hold off on the other 2 points so that we have plenty of time for discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. We actually might have a bit of time. So could I, if you'd either like to sort of speak to the next 2 points, or the promise of speaking a little further to vaccines, which you'd mentioned in the paper, since we don't seem to have questions in the chat at the moment, could I ask you to pick up on either of these? Sure,
and I think that one thing we could also do, if we have a little extra time, is just talk back and forth across the panel about some of our different pieces. But I guess I'll say a little bit about both things. IP, so the last 2 points were that IP tends to concentrate political power. It's a hypothesis. I think those familiar with dynamics of lobbying will find this unsurprising, to say the least. And, you know, I myself have written about the fact that one shouldn't think about these dynamics as mathematical equations, because of course people's interests have to be interpreted, and there have been very substantial consumer rights or public facing mobilizations that have had success. And yet I think it is also hard to deny that there is a very, very powerful way in which the ability to make very sizable gains does allow companies, and particularly rights holders who can make those gains and then capitalize upon them, right? To spend a lot, to spend an awful lot on lobbying. And doesn't mean they always win, but they certainly have advantages in that regard. And the last piece that we should look to information and IP for remedies, I think what I try to say in this piece of the draft, and be curious to talk to others about, are the limits of a simple tax and transfer model of thinking about addressing inequality. And of course, at a global scale, we don't have a tax and transfer system. Interesting developments in that regard that I think are beginning to happen on the global scale, but we're certainly very far from something that could address inequality, even should we wish to do so at the global level in that way. So, but also thinking domestically, I think there's lots of reasons to think about what some people like Jacob Hacker call pre-distribution instead of redistribution as one important policy lever that we have to address. And I think I'm very much somebody who's written about other forms of innovation as being central to our quest. So if you're concerned, for example, about health inequality, it would make every sense in the world, rather than thinking about the tax system, to think about how we can direct innovation and develop innovation policies that will address the health indicators that we have concern with. And of course, the underlying impulse here is thinking about politics as opposed to the market as the appropriate means of deciding what it is that we want our innovation policy to do. So a little bit on global vaccines. So I think what we see here today in COVID is in many ways quite predictable. I suspect surprises nobody here, except maybe our collective surprise and happiness that the vaccines actually have worked as well as they have. But the fact is, what we have is an extraordinarily concentrated global supply chain. We have exactly what we saw, whether it was with bird flu or HIV, in terms of the domination of the markets in the north. Bird flu was exactly this scenario of advanced purchase contracts for something that fortunately did not turn out to be a pandemic, but advanced purchase contracts all for the north, very little, whatever sort of leftovers were available, allocated to middle and low income countries. COVAX is essentially that model. It's a leftover model. It doesn't even have a theory. This is the global facility to try to bring vaccines to low and middle income countries. It doesn't even have a theory of what's necessary, because I think people are quite clear that what's necessary isn't going to happen. And of course, this raises interesting questions about the role of intellectual property in that dynamic. I think there's no doubt, but that in my own view, from my long experience in the pharmaceutical industry, that there are many manufacturers out there in the world who could manufacture. Remember, there's many kinds of these vaccines that could manufacture, certainly some of them, in fact, probably quite quickly and with fairly minimal technology transfer. Others would take more months, but I think something like 6 to maybe 8, 9, something like that is what we would be talking about with, and technology transfer would be required. The tech transfer is importantly as much about the regulatory apparatus for some of these vaccines as it is about actually getting to scale. Of course, there are intellectual property barriers that we expect to those scale up of vaccines. That is true in the United States as well as in other countries, because of the incredible web of patents. I don't know if you've looked at some of the recent publications, like the one in Nature showing the web of patents around COVID vaccines, but as one would anticipate with something that is a promising and highly lucrative technology, there's a web of patents all throughout, for example, the mRNA production process, and held by many, many companies, and in fact have been already patent battles in this context. So there are issues with a kind of thickets and so forth that I think would be of concern to any country that decided, the United States including, we are going to go all in and develop our own, use something like what we have in the United States, the Defense Production Act, to scale up vaccination. Nobody knows where these patents, in which countries these kinds of patents are held, because we don't have a system that makes that plain. And so I think we don't have precise answers to how much of a barrier patents are in, let's say, South Africa versus, India versus other places. But I think there's reason to think that there would be patent claims that would become an issue. And of course, as everybody on this call knows, we have forms of flexibility in the international agreements that do allow countries to override patents, but of course they don't deal well with thickets because everything has to be on an individual basis. They don't deal well with exports because you have to go through this rather remarkably bureaucratic process of labeling and notifying anything that's intended under compulsory license for export. And the reality is the intellectual property law that we have globally, really, in my own view, and here I'll just be polemical for a moment, has no business in this place. That we don't think it's done anything for us in terms of innovation. There's nobody out there in the world, I think, who thinks, my God, we wouldn't have these COVID vaccines, but for the market. In South Africa and India, nonsense. We have them because of billions and billions of dollars of public investment, and of course also private investment. We have them because of markets in the north, and they were absolutely sufficient to get them. It took an enormous amount of government investment, and so in some sense, we ought to, I think, flip the conversation and ask why we would imagine we wanted intellectual property in this space. We do want innovation, but that, of course, as I've sort of tried to say earlier, is a different matter. How do we get innovation in response to global health needs is a very different matter than a conversation more narrowly about intellectual property. So I will probably stop there, having taken a little bit more of the time of the group.
That's incredibly helpful as sort of a framing for how IP actively promotes sort of inequality in various structural ways. So that's wonderful. I would like to invite Rochelle to take the floor next. Rochelle, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And hi, everybody. And thank you, Daniel and Dev and Robert and everybody else who helped organize this really great workshop and inviting me to present. I'm going to see whether my slides work. Let's see. Can you see them?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, great. All right, so Amy offered these 5 hypotheses for how IP produces inequality, and it's hard not to agree with every single one of them. But I've been particularly interested in the third one, that IP is unequally available to all. So in her paper, and Frances also mentioned this, suggested that one problem with the current regimes is that IP fails to capture the kinds of creativity that are made by certain cultures, and that expanding rights over genetic resources, traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expression would provide something of an equalizing force. Now, I agree that recognizing these kinds of creative contributions is certainly important, but I suspect that true equality requires equalizing IP law in a different way as well. That equality requires an IP regime that enables and encourages the global South to attain technological inequality. That's something we don't have right now. So I think I have a heat map here, and you can see where innovation is occurring as measured essentially by indigenous patent holdings. And brightly lit, you see the United States, especially the coasts, Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. You also see some light in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Korea, South Africa, but much of the world is dark. And here's another perspective on the same phenomenon. And in my view, Francis Gurry is exactly right. Until we achieve technological equality, we're not going to get true equality. So can IP law actually help rather than hindered? Are there IP systems that might reduce technological inequality? Now, as many people have observed, the ability to invent often begins with learning by doing, working jobs that build technological sophistication and absorptive capacity, and that requires access rather than IP protection. But learning by doing is only a first step. The second is to push countries up the technological ladder by next establishing a class of what might be called mid-level innovators. So if that's right, then perhaps there are ways to structure the system that creates places where such innovators can operate successfully and beneficially. In the paper that Daniel and I wrote for the book that we are pre-launching today, we suggest one such place. And those are inventions created in the North, but which are maladapted to the South. So vaccines, of course, are one example. A lot of the mRNA vaccines have to be stored in ways that are incompatible with the infrastructure that much of the South has, or they're administered in ways that are very difficult for the South. And as everybody has said, if there's one thing the pandemic taught us, it's how important it is for a country to be able to manufacture, but also to adapt technologies to their own needs. So vaccines are one example. There are many others. Plants that don't grow well in certain regions' soil or climate, the harvester that isn't fit to deal with the crops that appeal to specific markets. These inventions present an opportunity for incremental innovation, an opportunity to adapt and then produce and disseminate inventions that meet domestic needs. Well, why aren't those opportunities being utilized? We suggest that the problem in current IP law is that these opportunities are stuck in what we call a novelty trap. The underlying inventions are patented in the North, but the original inventors aren't interested in adapting them to the South. Of course, mid-level innovators in the South could engage in that work, but they lack the economic incentive to do so. Because the world has moved to a standard of absolute novelty. Once the initial invention is available somewhere, it becomes prior art everywhere. This art then blocks the incremental innovator from obtaining the protection necessary to recoup the costs of adaptation, manufacture, dissemination, and also to earn a healthy profit. In other words, what we have is wasted technological opportunities, wasted intellectual potential, inventions that could be created but aren't, and a class of would-be inventors that don't have these really significant things that they could do. So our paper puts forth some ideas on how to break the novelty trap by devising an IP law better suited to the needs of development. And here are the basic contours. The first point is to redefine the landscape of prior art. Instead of the absolute novelty standard that's increasingly favored in the North, we suggest a rule of relative novelty. If the invention isn't patented in a particular country, call it Zandia, we'd regard it as not in the prior art for Zandia, even if it's patented elsewhere. That would break the novelty trap and allow Zandia to award protection to someone who adapts the invention and distributes it locally, and would make the invention available at prices set by local demand. Now, novelty is a highly technical test for determining patentability. To create more space for local inventors to operate, we also suggest a change in how inventive an advance must be in order to rate protection. Developed countries look to whether a person of ordinary skill, as measured globally, could have bridged the gap between the prior art and the new invention. We consider whether a person of ordinary skill in the art, as measured locally, would be able to make the new advance from what's already known locally. That might permit a local inventor to acquire protection for an adaptation of a foreign invention, even when that adaptation only represents a modest change. And since the patents would have to enable a local person with skill in the art, that system would also tailor disclosure to local absorptive capacity. Now, as Dan Burke and Mark Lumley have noted, current patent law already incorporates that type of an approach for technological sectors, where the skills of only persons in that field are considered for inventiveness purposes. That way, when a new field emerges and no one knows very much about it, it's relatively easy to show inventiveness and acquire patent protection. The ease of getting patents then induces more research into that area. As the field matures, the people in it gain skill. It then becomes harder to show inventiveness, and that in turn induces more ambitious work. The same idea could work geographically. since, as we posit, some countries start with less technological sophistication, locals should be awarded protection, even for what the North might regard as fairly incremental developments. As locals become more adept, more would be required until the domestic industry is inventing at global levels. In our view, these changes would not only encourage inventions better suited to local conditions, breaking the novelty trap would, as importantly, create a new lower rung on that ladder that reaches to the technological frontier. And that would give rise to a new set of inventors, patentees, examiners, investors, patent lawyers, jobs, training opportunities. It would, we think, be a first step toward reducing technological inequality. Now, one could go even further and limit the landscape of prior art to inventions actually practiced in Zambia, irrespective of whether they're patented there. That approach would create a larger opening for local entrepreneurs, along with pressure on the originator to establish a local industry himself. The rights to demand local working have been contentious for over a century, not clear what the TRIPS agreement actually does on that issue. This would serve as a substitute for that regime. Note that these are somewhat radical ideas now, but they weren't always. In fact, prior to TRIPS, countries developed their technological capacity in much this way. The Venetian Act of 1474 contemplated what we now call patents of introduction, and they recognized rights for those who brought foreign technology to Venice. Utility model laws for functional improvements were common even in some developed countries and were instrumental in helping them become important centers for innovation. Many of the Asian tigers we saw on that heat map developed systems of petty patents, exclusive rights over modest advances, to incentivize innovation and develop an entrepreneurial culture. Until 2013, the US had a relative novelty standard, somewhat similar to the one we recommend. An alternative, excuse me, suggested by WIPO and also UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, are various forms of commercialization patents. These give a degree of flexibility to the first person to commercialize. As such, they also deal with the problem of foreign inventors who sit on their inventions and fail to take the steps needed to manufacture, distribute, or educate locals about them. The foreign patent would, of course, dominate, but if the patentee refused to license without justification, a compulsory license could be used. Excuse me. So the changes we recommend in substantive patent law are not only already known, but also compatible with international law. International law contemplates alternative protection regimes. TRIPS doesn't define either novelty or inventive steps, so it leaves countries of at least some flexibility to define these things for themselves. Compulsory licensing is similarly a recognized flexibility. The bigger problem from an international law perspective arises because this scheme may not work if national treatment obligations must be satisfied. According to the same treatment to everyone might allow inventors of the North to crowd out locals and exacerbate access problems. In contrast, making a low standard available only to locals would not only unleash local inventiveness and entrepreneurship, it might also attract foreign investment in local enterprises. The MFN obligation is also an obstacle because this scheme would work best if a group of developing countries created a unitary right, much like the EU's planned unitary patent. That would allow the right holder to benefit from economies of scale. It would create a market big enough to ensure an adequate return on investment. It would save administrative costs, and it would create some pressure for technology transfer. Now, of course, we realize that national treatment and MFN are regarded as the cornerstones of the international trade system. However, in the IP world, both these obligations have long been regarded with skepticism. As to national treatment, back in 1975, when patent harmonization was first debated in WIPO, and then later in the GATT negotiations, UNCTAD said a lot of what we're saying today, that intellectual property exacerbates problems of equality, treating countries that are not technologically equivalent as if they are equal is not, UNCTAD said way back then, not non-discrimination. It lets the haves have more, as Amy just said, and functions as a reverse system of preferences. UNCTAD, for one, recommended a preferential system for developing countries, and that's what we argue for here. Furthermore, as Henning Gross-Ruß-Kahn has pointed out, there's a disjuncture between the GATT and TRIPS. The GATT's non-discrimination provisions apply to products, but only to like products. In contrast, TRIPS measures discrimination by simply comparing the nationality of right holders. It never asks if nations are alike in relevant respects. So aside from all the substance of patent law, this provision really puts people in developing countries in a position that is unequal. MFN has an even more checkered career in IP circles. When the Berne Convention on Copyright was negotiated, MFN was rejected as an idea, at least in part because it tends to keep pushing IP protection up, when in fact IP seeks a delicate balance between the interests of proprietors and the public. I should say one more thing. We realize that changing IP law will not be sufficient to change that heat map. Technological inequality has many root causes, including the absence of venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, lawyers, infrastructure like laboratories and roads, a trained workforce, even an appreciation for acquiring human capital, good institutions for governance, for education, first-class universities, for capital accumulation, stock market, banks, and for risk-taking, bankruptcy law. But these factors are interdependent. A country needs a research base to create incentives to adopt a strong patent system. It needs a patent system to attract venture capitalists, high-tech jobs to make it worth acquiring human capital, seekers of education to promote the need for universities. Developing a new entry point, creating an IP law genuinely available to all by removing the novelty trap is a way to get a virtuous cycle of this type going and reduce, if not end, both technological and economic inequality, or so we hope. So thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Rochelle. You've answered a question from the previous panel. Vicky Long had asked about innovations in developing countries, which are mostly incremental and cumulative. And your whole presentation has pretty much directly answered that question. During your presentation, OS raised a question which said this sounded a little bit like patents of innovation, importation historically, and you spoke to Venice and sort of the historical dimensions of it. I might raise one question from Graham Dutfield now, and we can circle back to your answer to it at the end. And Graham's question is twofold. He's saying LDCs lack patent attorneys, so even if they put in place local novelty, will they be able to actually make use of it? And then his follow-up question is, this sounds along the lines of introducing utility models, so would that be a better alternative? So the lack of patent attorneys and utility models, if I can just leave that with you, and we'll circle back to these questions in the general discussion. Peter, over to you, please.
Thank you, Dave. So let me start by thanking the organizers, Daniel, Robert, and Dave for this wonderful event. I also want to thank Daniel for being the driving force for both the book project, as well as getting all of us to think more deeply about a lot of the issues relating to IP and global inequality. So what I want to do in this presentation is to actually pick up on what Amy and Rochelle have started off us on, as well as someone touched on in the first panel with respect to the North-South debate. And I think with respect to COVID, I think there's a lot of discussion about the divide between developed and developing countries, or the North and the South. And what I'm suggesting here in this presentation, as well as in my book chapter, is that it's actually much more complicated. And we have seen this in the ongoing discussion with respect to COVID. There are a lot of emerging countries, which are upper middle income countries, that have been taking positions that are somewhat different from the developing countries. So what we have seen is actually a more complicated picture. And so a few years ago, I wrote a book chapter called The Middle Intellectual Property Powers. What I did is basically do a survey on 10 countries that are outside the OECD and that has about, I think, $15,000 in the global, gross national income, as well as substantial intellectual property activities and research developments. And so here you can see in a table that includes the 5 BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa, as well as 5 other countries, Argentina, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand. And if you look at this table right here, you can see that a lot of these countries have very substantial developments in the IP area. And that is somewhat different from what we normally describe about the developing countries. So in the Q&A from the chat, I can see there are already questions about, for example, least developed countries. When you look at these countries, they are as far away from the least developed countries as you can get. And if you look at the Global Innovation Index, you can also see that all of them are within the top 85 in the world. And I also added Vietnam because Vietnam was not included at that time when I was doing the study a few years ago. But at the same time, Vietnam is number 42 based on the latest Global Innovation Index. If we follow what we have based on the WIPO statistics with respect to Patent Cooperation Treaty, you can see that 10 of all the 11 countries right here are within the top 70 or so countries. And out of the 7 countries, out of the 11 countries, 7 of them are actually within the top 40 in terms of the PCT applications based on the country. In terms of the international trademark applications in the matrix system, you can also see that except for South Africa, which is 114, all of them are within the top 100 in the world, and 8 of them are actually within the top 50 in the world in terms of matrix applications. So I think what you see from these slides right here show that we're going to have a very different development with respect to the middle income countries than what we traditionally describe with respect to the North-South debate. And when we think about the debate, we always see them as the 2 opposite ends of the pole in terms of how strong they want the IP system to be. And middle income countries fall onto into the middle right there. But I think the important takeaway here is that the middle income countries have been moving closer and closer to the global north, in part because they have more intellectual property activities as well as research and development within the country. And so in the negotiations with respect to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which has become a CPTPP, we can see that Malaysia and Vietnam are taking, or at least willing to accept stronger position in the intellectual property area than they normally would do if they are situated in the global south. And we also see similar positions taken in the recently completed IB chapter for the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And so one interesting question is that, well, whether a lot of the middle income countries are actually moving closer to the global north and what it means in the north, to the north-south debate in the international IP law and policy. An issue that's related to this particular conference as well as the project is about global inequality. As a lot of the middle income countries get closer to global north, and then we're going to see a very different picture with respect to global inequality in the sense that the inequality between those 2 groups of countries are actually closing very quickly. And so that would change the discussion with respect to how we're going to address global inequality, especially between the global north and the global south. So far, I've been highlighting issues about inequality among countries, but a very important discussion that is a little bit behind, I would say maybe a decade or 2, is about inequality within countries. And I think it's especially important for those countries that are usually considered as in the global south, as well as those who are now actively emerging. And so if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 10 talks about reduced inequality both within and among countries. It's not just about among countries, the North-South debate, but also about inequality within countries. And that is the focus I will have for the next few minutes. So there's 3 different types of inequality we see when we talk about inequality within countries. The first one is geographic inequality. So I use the example of China because I have done quite a bit of research in this area, but I also find it very useful because we have very useful statistics based on different regional development. So this is a table that includes the patent applications and patent grants for the top 20 provinces within China. If you look at the first 3 provinces, you can see that there has the applications in a range of 200,000 to over 100,000. In terms of patent grants, you have the range of about 60,000 from about 30,000. If you go down to the bottom, 18, 19, 20, you can see that it's about 8,000 patent applications to 10,000 patent applications, or about 2,000 patent grants or so. And so this is a very different picture that we're going to see. And below that, below the table, you also see other provinces and autonomous regions that are not even included in this table because they fall below the 2,000 patent grants right there. And so I think that's a very good example of the geographical inequality that we're going to see in a lot of countries, especially in the emerging world. But it's not only just China, it's also Brazil, India, Russia, a lot of the BRICS countries, as well as other countries I mentioned earlier. So one of the interesting things that the Global Innovation Index, as well as the 2019 WIPO report has done is include the different local hotspots or the science technology clusters. So here on the chart, you can see that a lot of the clusters within the different countries have been very active, but they are very geographically dispersed within the country. And so one question that we have to ask is that, well, the more we think about intellectual property policy, the more we need to pay attention to the innovation geography that's going on within the country. Now, some people may wonder whether this actually will be quite different from what we have seen. For example, in the US, we also have certain places that are highly innovative, and so is a lot of countries in Europe. But if you look at this article right here, you can see that what we see in India and China are very different. With respect to the EU, the concentration is 35%. With respect to the US, it's about 50%. Whereas in India, you can see that the 5 most innovative regions cover 75% of Indian patents. In China, the 5 regions cover almost 80% of the patent applications. So what I'm going to suggest here is that the type of inequality we see in those emerging countries are also more extensive than what we've seen in the developed countries. The second type of inequality is about sectoral inequality based on different industrial sectors. And so when I put together the top 50 corporate applicants from the PCT from last year, there are 13 companies right here from China. And what's interesting is that all of them basically focus on electronics, technology, and telecommunications. So you can see that the development within China, despite all the discussion about how China has been finding a lot of PC applications, they got skewed into certain industrial sectors. And I think that is also quite true for a lot of countries in the emerging world. So for the middle income countries, when you think about India, you can think about pharmaceuticals, information technology. Brazil, we have Embraer and Petrobras. And so that's typically the case for a lot of middle income countries where they have certain specialized areas that have been highly developed. And you can see that there's high disparity with respect to the different industrial sectors within the country. And the last type of inequality is about income inequality. And I think that will be the focus on a lot of the presentations from tomorrow. And what's going to be difficult with respect to income inequality is that it goes in both directions. So if you look at those, the table right here, you can see that China, India, South Africa, the inequality has actually increased after implementing the TRIPS agreement. And so the comparison is between the Gini coefficients in 1995 and 2005. You can see the increase right there. But at the same time, you also see the decrease with respect to Brazil, Malaysia, and Russia. And one of the challenges with respect to the WTO reforms is that it goes in different directions. Some is about intellectual property, some is about agriculture, some is about textiles. And so a lot of countries are basically having more constraints in the intellectual property area, but at the same time, opening up and welcoming more foreign investment at the same time. And that's why it's quite inconclusive in terms of what type of evidence we have about the role of IP in relation to income inequality. But I think the important takeaway here is that, as I've mentioned earlier on in the presentation, that we have been reducing inequality between the global north and the middle income countries. And yet we see that the inequality within those countries stay behind or has not changed that much, right? So there's a very interesting ongoing discussion among the economists, and here in the slide I include Branko Milanovic, where he talked about how with the shrinking global inequality, we'll have more great salience to inequalities within nations. And I think that is quite interesting in terms of both this project as well as the ongoing discussion about inequality within countries. So what can we do about it? Well, I'm going to end with three different sets of interventions. And for those of you who are curious about some of the presentation I made right here, the chapter is available online, and so feel free to get it from there. And so the first one is about international norm setting. We tend to focus on the global debate, thinking about how we should not have one-size-fits-all system for different countries. But we rarely get beyond the territorial borders to ask whether one-size-fits-all actually work for countries inside, in part because we always believe that countries should be able to decide on its own how they want to do it. But from the academic standpoint, I think we actually can do more academic and policy research in terms of how this will play out at the subnational level. One big question with respect to the TRIPS agreement and WTO is that, can countries offer different levels of protection within the border? I think the quick reaction is that, well, there's Article 27. It says that patents shall be available for any inventions in all fields of technology. So no discrimination there and no distinction between products and processes. It also states that patent rights are enjoyable without discrimination as to the place of invention, right? So that goes to some of the discussion I had earlier about geographic inequality. But there are also cases in the WTO, for example, the panel report on Canada pharmaceutical case, where the panel actually talk about the distinction between discrimination and differentiation, right? So there's actually a bigger space for us to actually explore in this area, whether we can actually have subnational policy variations. And in a lot of countries, there are also differences of protection, whether in terms of what we have in the case law or in terms of what we have in terms of enforcement, right? So in the US, we usually talk about the circuit split. You can see that different countries, different regions within a country offer different levels of protection. And so there's some type of margin of differentiation even within a country. And that's true not just for the US, but also true for a lot of other countries. And within the WTO and also international trading system, a lot of countries, especially those in the developing world, are also increasingly embracing the free trade zones to have different type of rules that are within those zones that are different from other parts of the country. And so I think there's actually something we can look into to see whether we can push for more differentiation within the region at the subnational level. The second set of intervention is about national policy making. So in some of the presentations that we have earlier, talk about the different ways we can adjust the IP system. I think we shall also talk about how we can actually address the novelty trap. And so here is a slide that includes the different types of limitation exceptions that might be helpful, as well as other measures that go beyond the IP area to, for example, anti-competitive practices. But I think it's also very important for us to go beyond substantive reforms to think about whether we need to have institutional reforms. New forms of IP rights, I think I piggyback on Francis Goury earlier presentation, talking about for example, traditional knowledge. I think Robert started on us on that one as well. And we can think about alternative incentive frameworks. I think that is very salient in light of what's going on with COVID. A lot of countries are looking for alternative frameworks to actually address some of the issues relating to both intellectual property and innovation. Think about new concepts of innovation. What's interesting for me, for a lot of middle-income countries, is that the concept of innovation is actually very different. Because when we think about intellectual property, we usually think about the three main branches of IP rights, and then we think about other types of IP rights that are included in the international agreements. But when we think about innovation, it's much broader. It's not just about IP-based innovation, but also cover other types of innovation. So I think that would be quite fruitful when we think about the different ways to improve the IP system. But I think we also need to think about the impact of the IP system on equality. For example, what are the distributive effects of IP rights? Can we introduce preemptive or correction mechanisms? Or can we actually bring in redistribution policies that are both inside IP as well as outside IP? Right. So Amy, in her presentation, toward the very end, talked about tax and transfer mechanism. Can we think of the tax and transfer mechanism outside IP that will help address some of the inequality that's been created within IP system? Those are things that will be quite valuable to consider. And the last area that I think could be useful in terms of intervention is academic and policy research. There are two lines of inquiry I think will be quite important. The first line of inquiry is front and center, with respect to this event. It's about the relationship between IP and global inequality. And as you can see from tomorrow's presentations, you will find that we actually don't know enough about the relationship between IP and global inequality, and is an area that we actually should pay more attention to. The second area of inquiry is about the middle income countries. I think we have some books and articles about the BRICS countries, as well as some individual countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, Argentina, a few of them. But at the same time, I think it's important for us to actually think about whether we can do more research across the middle income countries and do some comparison to see whether what we learn about the global north or the global south actually is still valid with respect to the fast-paced development in a lot of the middle income countries. So those are the different interventions I share with you. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was absolutely fantastic. There was a lot in there, and I liked in particular your focus on internal inequality within a country, sort of geographical and sectorial dimensions. And in a sense, I thought Rochelle's paper spoke to some of that. With the kinds of innovations she was talking about, they wouldn't tend to cluster in the same kind of hotspots within a country that you might otherwise sort of see. I'd like to do a couple of things. Before anything else, I'd like to thank Amy, who has to race off to a meeting in the next minute. So if she's still here with us, a very heartfelt thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thanks, Amy.
Yes, thanks, everybody.
Great. I'd also like to flag up a conversation between Amy and Rahul Bajaj in the chat, which I'll just leave for you to read. And it's on India's and South Africa's TRIPS waiver proposal and India's motivation for doing it, feeling not confident enough in its own domestic mechanisms and flexibilities, and therefore going for a more all or nothing sort of framework. So that's an interesting question and answer to pick up on. I'm going to turn to Rochelle to respond to Graham's questions. But before that, there's a general question for our speakers, which is when it comes to IP inequality, often you need to contextualize your response. So you need a right-specific, context-specific, set of people-specific responses. And this is a question from Rahul Bajaj. So can we come up with general prescriptions, or do we need context-specific prescriptions in a copyright and music context? For example, the way rules are drafted may affect Black people differently because of the way you conceive sort of music and how it's created. So do we need context-specific responses to IP and inequality is the general question. We'll overshoot by 5 minutes. I'm going to ask for the audience's indulgence. We'll end by 5 past. I'd like to invite Rochelle to respond and then open up the general question of context-specific responses to the panel.
Okay, so on lawyers, so one question that Graham asked was about you need local lawyers. And I think there's an old paper by Daniel and I think Bruno Salama, who I think is also online, about Brazil. And one of the points they made in that paper, as I remember it, is that there are lots of lawyers in Brazil, and that helped create a more innovative atmosphere there. And I think you could say the same about India. Certainly a long cultural tradition of lots of lawyers trying to create law that is unique to India. So I think that's a really, really important point. And so the question is how you actually create those lawyers. Now, in the US, a lot of patent lawyers start off in the patent office, and then they move from being examiners to being lawyers. That's a really dangerous move, I think, on an international level, because there's also a paper by Peter Dreyhaus that shows that patent examiners get socialized by the European Patent Office and by the US Patent Office, and maybe to some extent the Japanese Patent Office, into really liking Northern type IP and Northern type patent law. Amy, unfortunately, had to leave, but she's got a paper in which she talks about trying to create some of the same sort of epistemic networks among countries that are in the global South. And so that might be a way where you have the lawyers in India and in Brazil, being able to be the people who train lawyers in other developing countries, rather than have them going to the EPC and learning how wonderful the EPC system is. So that's that question. The second question was about would the utility model work as well? A utility model, as I understand it, and I might be wrong about this, is still measuring the incremental innovation from the global level of innovation that's out there. So it's still that same novelty trap problem. It might be a lower amount of inventiveness that you have to do above the level of international knowledge base, but it's still the international knowledge base that counts. And one of the things that we think is important is, and now getting to the third question, is to contextualize knowledge much more, and to think contextually about what people in the local area actually know at that point, what they know and what they're capable of innovating. And that it's very, how you do that within a single country, to get to Peter's point, is hard, I think, but to be able to do that from country to country or from region to region, which is the way I think it would work better, is a way on the patent side of trying to contextualize our understanding of what inventiveness is to the local community's status at that particular point in time. In some sense, some places it might be that they know more. I mean, maybe they know more about some kinds of irrigation systems or something like that. But on the whole, when you think about coming up to the, until the technological frontier, I think it will often be that a lower level of inventiveness will be required. On the copyright side, not my area. So somebody else can talk.
Peter, last couple of minutes, any quick thoughts?
So in the interest of time, I would take the more big picture view to answer the question. I think if you look at what's going on in China, India, Brazil, a lot of those emerging countries I mentioned in the presentations, they have been very successful in overcoming a lot of the challenges posed by the TRIPS agreement as well as the WTO, because they practice selective adaptation, right? So context is very important in the sense that you have to look at what type of agreement, and then you have to implement it in a way that is faithful to your local conditions. And I think that's also quite beneficial at the global level. So I'm a big believer of legal transplant, but I think it's an important thing to actually think of not just legal transplant, but also legal transformation. When we are going to transplant certain type of models, we also need to think about how we need to adapt it better to local conditions. And once we adapt it better to local conditions, we will also provide lessons for others to see where they need to further improve the model. So I think that would be quite useful that way. And so I'll end on something that actually goes back to Amy's presentation about law and political economy. I think there's a tendency when we think about looking for context, we're going to go for evidence-based IP policymaking. The difficulty, though, is that a lot of times when you have a lot of the lobbying and interest group politics going in, we end up with IP-based evidence making instead of evidence-based IP policy making, right? So I think the more we need to think about context, the more we also ask how we can actually find information about the context, because that will actually go back to some of the things that Amy mentioned with respect to political economy.
Thank you. That's a fantastic sort of note to end on. And all that remains is to thank our panel. So thank you to Amy, to Rochelle, to Peter for 3 fantastic presentations. The questions are still coming, and I'm sorry we can't respond to the more recent ones, but the speakers can pick up on them and sort of choose to respond, or perhaps tomorrow. I'd like to once again thank Daniel, Robert, colleagues at Haifa for sort of setting this up for us. And just a reminder, same time tomorrow, we're going to launch at 4 p.m. UK time, and we start with our keynote from Professor Joseph Stiglitz. So we look forward to welcoming you back tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. That's an official sign off from us. Thank you. Say anything at the end? Daniel, would you like to say anything, or are we officially done?
I think you said it all.
All right. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.